Hi everyone, I'm Hugo Mell and I work at the National Museum of Natural History in Paris. Today I'm going to talk about a systematic review project that has been going on for several years in my team, and which aims to assess to what extent transport infrastructure verges constitute a habitat or corridor for biodiversity, and in which context. So first of all, why are we interested in this particular topic? Well, transversally, we know that transport infrastructure increase landscape fragmentation and create barriers for the movement of organisms across patches. But longitudinally, their verges provide a continuous strip of habitat, often semi-natural, and so this suggests that, well managed, they could potentially be an important part of ecological networks. So this subject was raised during the development of the Tram Vert et Bleu, which is a French public policy which aims to identify, preserve and restore ecological networks at various scales. And in 2015, LTI managers proposed that green verges should be part of the network. However, because there was no consensus in the scientific community on the real contribution of green verges, a systematic review was planned to collect and analyze the scientific evidence available. For those who may not be familiar with systematic reviews, they provide a rigorous and transparent methodology to conduct evidence synthesis. And for this project, we followed the guidelines from the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence to make sure that our work was replicable, that we addressed sources of bias in the publications collected and also in the review itself, and to report results in a standardized way. At the beginning of the project, we published a protocol for the review, and because we collected a lot of studies, we decided to do 3 distinct reviews, one on insects and one on vertebrates which are already published, and one on the flora which I am currently working on. 3 reviews had the same primary question, which was further divided into 6 sub-questions, depending on whether the study looked at the role of habitat or corridor of the verges, and on the type of treatment investigated, which could either be the impact of interventions on verges, so usually different management practices, a comparison between biodiversity within and outside of transport verges, or the influence of the surrounding landscape. Apart from the biological population considered, the scope of the review was always the same. So for insects, vertebrates, and flora, we always included studies about at least one of 5 types of transport infrastructure, which were paved roads, including highways, railways, waterways, power lines, and pipelines. Because the subject of the review was quite broad, and the project initiated by LTI managers in France, we decided to include only studies conducted under temperate climate. So for that we used the Köppen-Geiger climate classification to decide whether an article should be accepted or rejected based on the location of the study sites. As I mentioned already, we focused only on insects, vertebrates and vascular plants for the flora. We only included articles that reported empirical data, so opinion and discussion papers, reviews, purely theoretical papers, and papers with only simulations were all rejected. And finally, we also included grey literature, which can be an important source of empirical evidence. So as shown on this diagram, we started with a review with over 90,000 documents. Then during the screening phase, we filtered out all the studies that fell outside of the scope of the review. And once we had identified the relevant studies, we critically assessed their level of bias and kept only the ones with a low or medium susceptibility to bias for the systematic reviews. And so at the end of this process, we eventually ended up with 104 studies for insects, 128 studies for vertebrates, and 459 studies for the flora. So now, if we look at the number of studies for the different types of infrastructure and for different questions, we can start to identify knowledge clusters and knowledge gaps in the literature. So on the 2 graphics, you can see that the great majority of studies were about roads and waterways and concerned the role of habitat or verges and not the function of corridor. Okay, so now for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus on the results for question 2, which corresponds to studies that compared the biodiversity in LTI verges to the one in similar habitats away from transport infrastructure. And I will do so because we could gather enough homogeneous studies for this question to perform meta-analysis for abundance and species richness. Okay, so here you can see the results for the abundance of insects given for the different types of infrastructure and by trophic level. So for omnivorous species, pollinators, primary consumers and secondary consumers. And below each effect size, on the left you have the number of cases used to compute the effect size, and on the right the number of independent studies from which they were extracted. And the effect size was calculated in such a way that above the zero line means that the abundance was higher in the verges compared to the control sites. If it crosses the line, it means that the difference was not significant, and if it's below the line, it means that the abundance was lower in verges compared to the control sites. So you can see that in most cases, the difference was not significant between verges and control sites. But for non-highway roads, there was a higher abundance of pollinators and also primary consumers in road verges compared to the control sites. For species richness, a similar pattern was found for the different types of infrastructure, but we did not have enough data to perform the analysis by trophic level, so the results are less robust. Okay, so now we can look at the results for the abundance of vertebrates this time, which is given separately for birds, small mammals, bats, and other mammals. So again, as you can see, in most cases, the difference in abundance between verges and control sites was not significant, except for the banks of waterways, where birds were more abundant, and for highway road verges, where there was less birds but more small mammals compared to the control sites. And for the species richness of vertebrates, we found a similar pattern for birds, meaning that there were more bird species on the verges of waterways, but less on the verges of highways compared to the control sites. And finally, here you can see the preliminary results for vascular plants, where this time we distinguished between plants that were native or exotic. And in orange, you also have the results for all plants regardless of their status. And so for the flora, we mainly found that the cover of exotic plants was higher on non-highway roads verges. We also found a lower cover of plants above pipelines, which was also true for native plants, as well as the higher cover of exotic plants in power line corridors, but these results only came from single studies, so they should be taken with caution. And for species richness, we found a similar pattern for non-highway roads verges, with again a higher number of exotic species on the verges. In conclusion, we've seen that abundance and species richness were mostly similar in verges and in habitats away from transport infrastructure. There was only a small number of studies for pipelines, power lines, and railways. And we've seen that there is a strong lack of research on the corridor function of LTI verges. We almost never found studies with very robust designs where measurements are taken before, during, and after interventions, both for the control sites and the treated sites. So such high quality studies would still be very valuable. Also, the level of perturbation or degradation of the reference habitats was not systematically detailed in the publications, which can make it difficult to interpret the significance of the differences between verges and control sites. And finally, it should be noted that more biodiversity along transport infrastructure might not always be desired. So for example, if we have more small mammals in road verges, it can increase the presence and therefore the risk of collision with their predators. So reflections at different scales are required to fully understand the impact of transport infrastructure on biodiversity. Thank you for your attention and see you for the questions.
Thank you, Hugo. You have time for to ask your questions. Yes, please.
Hello, I've got a question. The abundance of insects and flora were missing in your graphs for the railways. Is it the lack of the studies you mentioned in your conclusions, or what's the reason for it?
Yeah, exactly. That's if it's not on the graph, it's because we did not have cases for this particular combination of grouping with a biological group and type of LTE. So the reason is because during the reviews, we have several steps where we filter out some studies. And so sometimes it's quite strict because we need to be able to extract the relevant data for computing the effect size. So we need some means and some standard deviations in the best cases. And sometimes it's impossible to extract from the original studies. So that can be the reason why we cannot compute effect size from certain studies, and then for LTEs, we don't have results for this particular question. Or sometimes it's also because during the critical assessments of the quality of the studies, it was judged that the study had a high level or a high risk of bias because the methodology was not detailed enough, or the comparator used was not appropriate, or so sometimes it was for that we remove some studies. And also because this type of transport infrastructure were less represented in the corpus overall.
Other questions, please? Yeah.
Hi, Hugo. Thank you very much. I was wondering, have you considered different factors, like, for example, the surrounding landscape or the width of the verges? Is it important for your conclusions?
Yeah. So thank you for the question. So actually, the influence of the surrounding landscape was one of our sub-questions. So we initially wanted to look also at the influence of the surrounding landscape on the role of habitat, and also if it affects the dispersal of organisms in the verges versus outside. So for the surrounding landscape, it was a separate question for which we found studies, but they were not homogeneous enough to be included in a meta-analysis. But we look at the studies, and we in the papers we produce a narrative synthesis when we go over the different results and see if they were negative, neutral, or positive, and we described a little bit the studies. And so for the surrounding landscape, often we found that that semi-natural habitats improve the presence of semi-natural habitats around the verges improve the function of habitat. And for dispersal, it was we only have just a few studies, so not really broad results. And for the influence of the width of the infrastructure, that is something that we coded during the review. So we have some information, but we were not able to use it as a predictor because sometimes it's missing, and it was not possible. But we have the information in the database that is available with the article.